5:03 a.m., Persian Gulf, 38 nautical miles northwest of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. Iranian fast attack boats just departed a coastal facility near Bandar Abbas on a heading that intercept geometry analysis placed directly toward the Ford's outermost escort destroyer. 9 vessels, 3 formation elements of 3, moving at 40 knots. The outermost escort, the USS Truxtun, had 22 minutes before the range closed to engagement distance. The U.S. Navy deployed an immediate defensive formation. Welcome to Navy Strikeforce. Today, we're going inside the 143 minutes that followed that contact detection. 143 minutes in which a 9-boat Iranian approach toward the most powerful naval vessel in the United States fleet, a layered defensive formation deployment, and a sequence of decisions that escalated the visible American response without crossing into lethal engagement produced one of the most tactically instructive confrontations in recent Gulf history. This is what Carrier Strike Group defense against a coordinated fast attack boat threat actually looks like, and why defending a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier from a fleet of 13-meter speedboats is a more complicated problem than it sounds. To understand the specific challenge that 9 Iranian fast attack boats represented to the Ford Strike Group at 5:03 a.m., you need to understand how Carrier Strike Group defensive architecture is structured and where that architecture has deliberate gaps that adversaries can attempt to exploit. A Carrier Strike Group operating in the Persian Gulf is not a single vessel surrounded by a ring of escorts. It is a layered defensive system spread across hundreds of square nautical miles of ocean, with each layer optimized to defeat threats at a specific range and speed. The outer layer, guided missile destroyers and cruisers operating 20 to 40 nautical miles from the carrier, provides long-range air defense against ballistic missiles and cruise missiles using Aegis and SM-3 interceptors. The middle layer, closer-in surface combatants and submarine assets, addresses medium-range threats. The inner layer, CIWS systems, helicopters, and the carrier's own defensive armament, provides terminal defense at close range. This layered architecture is optimized against high-technology threats: ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, supersonic anti-ship weapons. It is less naturally suited to the specific tactical challenge of multiple small, fast, low radar cross-section surface vessels attempting to penetrate the formation at high speed. Fast attack boats are not high-technology threats individually. A single Bog Hammer-class fast attack craft, 13 meters long, fiberglass construction, radar cross-section smaller than many commercial fishing vessels, is not a significant threat to an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, let alone a Gerald R. Ford-class carrier. But 9 Bog Hammers, coordinated, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, moving at 40 knots in the pre-dawn hours when radar sea clutter is at its daily maximum, represent a threat that the defensive architecture handles less elegantly than it handles a ballistic missile. The asymmetry is intentional. Iran's fast attack boat doctrine is designed to exploit the gap between a defensive system optimized for sophisticated missile threats and the practical challenge of tracking and engaging multiple small, fast, maneuvering surface contacts in cluttered sea conditions at night. The USS Truxtun, one of the Ford Strike Group's outer escort destroyers, was the nearest American vessel to the departing Iranian formation. At 5:03 a.m., the Truxtun's surface search radar had picked up the 9 contacts as they cleared the harbor approach and consolidated their 3-element formation. The contact picture was clean: 9 distinct radar returns, heading, and speed consistent with a direct intercept approach toward the Truxtun's position. The Truxtun's commanding officer had the picture on the bridge within 2 minutes of initial detection. He immediately transmitted a contact report to the Ford's Combat Direction Center and to the Strike Group's Tactical Action Officer, while simultaneously beginning a series of actions that formed the first element of the defensive formation response. The Truxtun increased speed to 28 knots and began altering course in a series of deliberate changes designed to make her future position less predictable to the approaching Iranian formation. Not random maneuvering, but a systematic pattern of course changes intended to generate a future position that would be outside the optimal attack angle for any approach geometry the Iranians had pre-calculated for. At the same time, the fort's tactical action officer was activating the strike group's fast attack craft response protocol, a standing plan that had been developed specifically to address the multi-boat swarm threat and had been exercised regularly but never employed in an actual threat scenario in the Gulf. The protocol had 5 elements. Element 1, repositioning of the second outer escort destroyer, the USS Roosevelt, from her current position on the Ford's northwestern flank to an intercept position between the approaching Iranian formation and the Truxtun. 2 ships on the threat bearing, rather than 1, separated by 8 nautical miles, providing mutual support and creating a defensive line the Iranian formation would have to penetrate to reach the carrier. Element 2, launch of both of the Truxtun's embarked MH-60R Seahawk helicopters in surface warfare configuration. The MH-60R carries the AN/APS-153 multimode radar, which provides superior small surface contact tracking performance compared to ship-based surface search radar in high sea clutter conditions. More importantly, a helicopter positioned ahead of the ship can maintain visual and sensor contact with fast attack boats that are too low to the water surface to be tracked reliably by the ship's own radar. Element 3, repositioning of a P-8, a Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft from its current surveillance orbit 120 nautical miles south to an orbit over the threat area. The P-8A's synthetic aperture radar and electro-optical sensors would provide the strike group with a persistent overhead picture of the Iranian formation that neither ship-based radar nor helicopter-mounted sensors could match. Element 4, activation of the Ford's inner defensive perimeter, bringing the carrier's MH-60S helicopters and close-in defense systems to immediate response readiness. Element 5, transmission of a warning to the approaching Iranian vessels on Channel 16 and the Regional Military Maritime Coordination frequency. All 5 elements were initiated within 4 minutes of the Truxtun's initial contact report. The warning transmission at 5:09 a.m. identified the approaching vessels as engaging in unsafe and unprofessional conduct inconsistent with international maritime norms and directed all vessels to alter course away from the U.S. Navy formation immediately. No response. 9 Iranian contacts continued closing at 40 knots. At 5:11 a.m., the Roosevelt began her repositioning maneuver, increasing speed to 31 knots toward her new intercept position between the Truxtun and the approaching Iranian formation. The Truxtun's MH-60R helicopters, call signs Reaper 1 and Reaper 2, were airborne at 5:12 a.m. and began moving to their forward positions ahead of the ship. At 5:14 a.m., the P-8A arrived on station and immediately began transmitting a comprehensive picture of the Iranian formation. The P-8A's sensor suite revealed detail that the surface radar picture had not captured. The 3 3-boat elements of the Iranian formation were not arrayed in a simple line abreast approach. The lead element of 3 boats was on the direct bearing toward the Truxtun. The 2 flanking elements were on slightly divergent bearings. One element angled 15 degrees north of the lead axis. One element angled 18 degrees south. The flanking divergence was gradual enough to be ambiguous. It could represent a natural spread in the formation as the boats accelerated and individual commanders made small course corrections. Or it could represent a deliberate tactical deployment, the flanking elements gradually repositioning to approach the Truxtun from 3 different bearings simultaneously, creating an engagement geometry that would force the ship's defensive systems to address threats from 3 directions at once. The P-8A's observation, transmitted to the strike group's tactical action officer at 5:17 a.m., assessed the divergence as consistent with a deliberate flanking approach based on the consistency of the angular separation and the rate at which it was developing, not consistent with uncoordinated drift, consistent with a plan. This is where the defensive formation decision became genuinely complex. The Roosevelt was repositioning to cover the direct bearing toward the Truxtun, the lead Iranian element's axis. But the 2 flanking elements, if their divergence continued, would arrive at bearings that the Roosevelt's repositioning had not been designed to cover. and the Truxtun, continuing her evasive course changes, was gradually moving relative to the Iranian formation in ways that changed the flanking angles continuously. The tactical action officer aboard the Ford had to decide whether to modify the defensive formation to address the flanking divergence, which would require repositioning the Roosevelt to a different position and calling on additional assets, or maintain the current formation and rely on the Seahawk helicopters and their positioning flexibility to cover the flanking axes. This decision had to be made at 5:19 a.m., with the Iranian lead element 11 minutes from the Truxtun's position and the flanking elements potentially arriving within 2 minutes of the lead element on their divergent bearings. 3 options were available to the tactical action officer. Option A: modify the Roosevelt's repositioning to split her coverage between the lead axis and the northern flanking axis, while tasking Reaper 1 helicopter to maintain a blocking position on the southern flanking axis. Except that the Roosevelt's coverage of the direct lead axis would be reduced. Option B: maintain the current formation and accept that the Seahawk helicopters would need to handle the flanking elements, while the Roosevelt covered the lead axis. Higher risk to the helicopters if the Iranian flanking boats were armed with shoulder-fired air defense missiles. Option C: request additional surface combatant support from further within the strike group, accepting the 12 to 15 minute positioning delay that would result. What would you order? Comment A, B, or C below. Because the Ford's tactical action officer was already executing, he chose a modified version of Option A. The Roosevelt's repositioning bearing was adjusted 7 degrees north to provide coverage on both the lead axis and partial coverage of the northern flanking axis, while Reaper 1 was directed to the southern flanking axis, and Reaper 2 maintained its position ahead of the Truxtun on the lead axis. The formation adjustment was transmitted to the Roosevelt at 5:21 a.m. The destroyer altered course immediately. At 5:24 a.m., 21 minutes after initial detection, the Iranian lead element was 4 nautical miles from the Truxtun's position. The flanking elements were at 5.5 nautical miles on their respective divergent bearings. The Roosevelt was 6 nautical miles behind the Truxtun on the lead axis, speed 31 knots, positioning rapidly, but not yet at her coverage position. The Truxtun transmitted a second warning on Channel 16 at 5:25 a.m., this time specifically addressing the approaching Iranian vessels by their formation configuration, lead element and flanking elements, to signal that the U.S. Navy had full awareness of the tactical spread. The Iranian lead element began to slow at 5:26 a.m., from 40 knots to 32 knots. The closure rate dropped perceptibly on the radar display. The northern flanking element slowed 40 seconds later. The southern flanking element, the one that Reaper 1 was now directly overhead, held speed for an additional 2 minutes before reducing to 25 knots. At 5:31 a.m., the P-8A reported that all 3 Iranian elements were reducing speed and that the flanking divergence was reversing. The 2 flanking elements were beginning to converge back toward the lead element's axis, rather than continuing to open. The formation was consolidating. The coordinated multi-axis approach was collapsing back into a single formation. At 5:34 a.m., the lead Iranian element altered course northeast, away from the Truxtun's position, at 22 knots. The flanking elements followed over the next 3 minutes. By 5:38 a.m., all 9 Iranian vessels were on opening courses. The approach had been broken without a warning shot, without a weapon employment, and without physical contact between any vessel in the strike group and any Iranian boat. The 9 Iranian boats returned to their coastal facility at approximately 7 a.m. The post-incident assessment found that the defensive formation response, specifically the rapid repositioning of the Roosevelt and the helicopter forward positioning, had created a defensive picture comprehensive enough that the Iranian formation commander had assessed the cost of continuing as exceeding whatever benefit the penetration of the formation might have achieved. But the assessment also identified what the Iranian formation had collected during its 35-minute approach before turning away. The 9 boats had approached to within 4 nautical miles of the Truxtun and 5.5 nautical miles of the Roosevelt during the closing phase. At those ranges, passive sensor collection, visual observation, radar signature analysis, radio traffic monitoring provided information about the defensive formation's composition, spacing, and response timing that was unavailable from shore-based surveillance at greater distances. The slow approach, the flanking spread, and the careful observation of U.S. helicopter positioning and surface combatant repositioning had generated a detailed picture of how the Forward Strike Group's defensive formation responds to a 9-boat multi-axis fast attack approach. That picture was collected without a weapon being fired, without a hostile act being committed, and without any action that the rules of engagement framework in effect at the time would have authorized a lethal response to. In the weeks following the incident, the Strike Group's Tactical Action Team conducted an extensive review of the defensive formation protocol, identifying adjustments to the Roosevelt's repositioning geometry that would reduce the flanking coverage gap that the Iranian formation had attempted to exploit. The review also generated updated procedures for Seahawk helicopter employment in multi-axis boat threat scenarios. Both changes were incorporated into the Standing Fast Attack Craft Response Protocol. But the behavioral profile Iran had collected during those 35 minutes of careful, deliberate approach, the repositioning timelines, the helicopter deployment sequences, the coverage geometry of a 2-destroyer defensive line, was in Iranian files before the sun came up. 9 speedboats, no weapons fired, one complete picture of Forward Strike Group defensive doctrine in the Gulf. Stay sharp, stay informed. This is Navy Strikeforce. We'll see you in the next one.